Thank you for watching once again. This is Generally Nerdy. We are going to talk Spider-Man today. And not just Spider-Man, but a little more meta conversation about movies. So before we get into it, let's listen to that wonderful theme music.
Generally Nerdy.
So I saw Spider-Man, and it was good, but that's the problem. So this is going to be a little bit different from other reviews that I've done in the past, because I'm not going to dissect the movie one bit at a time. I'm not going to go through and do the plot, because it wasn't necessarily good enough to justify doing all of that. Is kind of one of the problems. It was entertaining. Like, I was entertained. I did not get bored through the movie. It was visually exciting, but there was no deeper stimulus. There was no depth to this, and we'll get to that in a minute. One bit of plot. Oh, and before we get too deep into this, spoiler alert, even though I'm not going to dissect the plot, I'm still going to talk about spoilery things. The twist at the end is going to get discussed. So, that's your warning. If you care about such things, then stop watching and watch the movie first. Anyway, back to what I was saying. The one bit of plot that I will get into, aside from the twist at the end, is the fact that we didn't see Uncle Ben die. And that's a good thing. If there's one thing in a Marvel movie that we never have to see again, it's Uncle Ben dying. He's done it twice. Sorry, Uncle Ben. We're moving on. We did get Hot Aunt May, which is an interesting. It's an interesting way to play Spider-Man, because every iteration of Aunt May before, she looks like she could be his grandma. The first time I ever saw anything Spider-Man when I was a kid, and it was the cartoon, and he did it before he called her Aunt May, I thought she was his grandma. And then he called her aunt, so I figured maybe great aunt or something, because she was so much older than him. And what we've seen in movies previously, probably partially because the actor playing Peter Parker was pushing through his 30s, Aunt May had to look older than him, so older meant blue hair. But that's not the case this time. Tom Holland is a kid. They got Marissa Tomei to be Aunt May, and she's beautiful. It makes more sense to me if Peter Parker is approximately 15, 16 years old. It makes more sense to me to have somebody who's in their 40s or 50s. I don't really know how old Marissa Tomei is, but she looks like she could be the aunt of a kid who's about 15, 16 years old, and not his grandmother. And that is kind of how I feel like it probably should have been for a long time. That just, I don't know, that leads us into a whole other conversation, probably for another video, about comic books and the creators and their disillusionment with what actual life is. But yes, Marissa Tomei, Michael Keaton, and Tom Holland all were spectacularly cast in their roles for this movie. Now, that all being said, those are all the good bits. The bad bits are, it was okay. It was just good, I guess is probably more appropriate. I've said it before, I'm not the biggest Spider-Man fan, so I don't really have a dog in this fight. Like, you can make a mediocre Spider-Man movie, that's fine. Make a mediocre comic book movie, and that's kind of whatever. I think the bigger issue is the general mediocrity of American cinema right now as a whole. The Nerd Writer channel I've been watching a lot recently, a little while ago, did a whole episode on the epidemic of passable movies. Looking at this movie, looking at the passability of this movie, this is one of those movies that he was talking about. This is part of the epidemic that we are in the middle of passable movies. Now, in his essay, the Nerd Writer talks about how passable movies are worse than bad movies because we don't feel anything for them. And I agree with that. However, I feel like there is more of a need for passable and bad. That way, when we get a good movie, when we get a Dark Knight Rises, when we get a Captain America Civil War, when we get these standout movies, they stand that much further out, and we have a greater appreciation for them. And not to say that there's no redemption, there's no redeeming value for Spider-Man Homecoming. That's not what I'm saying. The plot's pretty transparent. I mean, if you're really paying attention, you can kind of see the twist coming a long way away. So there's no reason to be surprised. But are you entertained? I feel like that's the key question to ask. Passable movies are a little bit of an epidemic right now. We have movies that aren't necessarily bad, but they definitely are not good either. Baby Driver's not one of them, so we'll talk about Baby Driver some other time. That movie's fantastic. But it's so we are reaching the point. This is where I'm going with this. We are reaching the point of critical mass, very rapidly. I feel like, with the influx of nerd culture, with the popularity of comic book movies, right now we are getting to a point where they are only going to be able to do the fantastic storylines. They're only going to be able to pluck from obscurity the really good comic books and not just whatever they want, not just any old superhero tale. I feel like the flaw with Spider-Man Homecoming, the reason it is only a passable movie and not a great movie and not one of the Marvel movies that will stand the test of time. Tony Stark. Spider-Man is such a character. Again, I'm not a huge Spider-Man fan, but I do know a bit about him. Spider-Man is such a character that he has a whole subsection of the Marvel Universe allotted to him, named after him, effectively, called the Spider-Verse. There are a million different versions of Spider people, and we can't seem to do them justice on screen. The established mythology, and I watched a video from Folding Ideas. It's a channel I've only found recently, but has been in existence for a while, as I'm sure plenty of people know, because he's got, I think, 1 million subscribers. No, 150,000 subscribers. Either way, a lot of people know about Folding Ideas, and if you don't, then check him out, because there's definitely some really great analysis on that channel. I mean, his personal politics are a little misguided in my opinion, but that's my opinion, and you go watch his channel and form your own. Anyway, so he has a video about the mythology of a superhero movie, and basically what he's saying is you have to reestablish the mythology every time you create a new universe, right? So the movies being their own universe, and less so on the Marvel side, more so on the DC side, every movie is its own universe, but every reboot, at the very least, begins its own mythology. And this being a reboot of Spider-Man, it begins its own mythology. And so, just because one mythology, or even the primary mythology, says that a thing is a certain way, doesn't mean it's that way in every mythology. So, Batman, for example. Batman is a certain way in primary mythology in the comic books, and he's definitely not that way in the new mythology that DC has created for him in the movies. And that is a source of much contention amongst nerds. And one of my sources of contention with the new movie Batman is that he's so drastically different from the Batman I've grown to love. And I don't feel like they've paid enough tribute, they've given enough credence to the source material to make up for that. So, translating that to Spider-Man, we know a few things about Peter Parker and Spider-Man. One of which is that Peter Parker is a boy genius. He's a high school student. In this movie, he is a sophomore. And I feel like that is one of the younger versions I've been privy to. I don't read a whole lot of Spider-Man, so I'm sure there could be a version in the comic books that's that young or younger. And I know you visit his childhood throughout the course of the comics, so there's that. However, we don't get much of his genius. He created web shooters, and he created his webbing, which we got in Civil War. So that was already an established element. Like, yeah, we see that he's smart. We see that because he got this bite from this radioactive spider, which they only pay lip service to briefly, which is weird, but good. Like, again, we didn't spend a whole lot of time establishing a character that everybody already knows, so that's totally understandable. However, I feel like we could have gotten a little bit more time establishing his intelligence. Even though we see his webbing, and even though, Tony Stark, Spider-Man's a genius. Spider-Man is a genius rivaling Tony Stark. This movie doesn't touch on Spider-Man mythology nearly at all. The primary mythology this movie serves is the Iron Man mythology. That's not entirely a bad thing if it wasn't titled Spider-Man. We get nothing of the Spider-Verse. We get one villain, the Vulture. Not even like a reference to any other villains. One villain. And it's basically like an evil Iron Man is kind of the way they show him. And his like the focus isn't even necessarily on the Vulture. Michael Keaton is fantastic. Michael Keaton is one of my favorite actors. Michael Keaton is one of the best actors of this generation. That is not up for debate. However, they don't give him the weight. There's a twist at the end that if you're paying attention, you see at least halfway through the movie, which is a good 30 minutes to 45 minutes before you even get to the twist. So the twist is not a huge surprise. And even if you're not paying attention, about 10 minutes before you get there, you're like, oh. So there's no gravity given to the character of the Vulture because he is deeply related to that twist. The gravity is given to Peter's relationship with Tony Stark and Spider-Man's relationship to Iron Man, because the fucking suit that he's wearing, he gets from Tony Stark. The mythology I'm familiar with, Spider-Man makes his own suit. Granted, it takes him a while to get to the really awesome suit that he wears that everyone knows, which we saw in the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. Is, you know, he had to go through a couple of iterations before it got good. And yes, in the comics, eventually he does have a suit from Tony Stark, but it's an iron spider suit, which we see in the movie, which is so badass. Like, but there's only so much that can be said about, oh my god, I'm seeing this thing from the comic books on the movie screen right now. Like, that only takes you so far. So once you're beyond the superficial flash, like, there's no substance to this movie, unless you're just looking to expand Tony Stark's story. Depth. This movie has no depth. We don't see the little bit of genius that we do see comes from Peter's little buddy, who I can't remember the kid's name. I know he's in the comics. I know they changed his character a little bit for this movie. But I can't remember his name, so sue me. But just doesn't make any sense. Peter Parker should be able to handle, and again, we do see his homemade webbing, and we do see his homemade web shooters in this movie, because at one point he loses his Tony Stark suit. But the Tony Stark suit has Tony Stark webbing, has Tony Stark artificial intelligence, has everything branded Stark, and nothing to do with Peter Parker or Spider-Man. I don't understand why we can't get this right. It's like Fantastic Four. You've got the best team superhero team. Scratch that, reverse it. You've got the best superhero team in existence, and you can't make a good movie with them? Shit, in the last movie, we get, 10 minutes of action in the entire 2-hour running time? Just doesn't make sense. There's a little bit of action. We kind of get to know Peter Parker as a character a little better. It's fantastic that Tom Holland can portray him in such a way that he seems like a kid, because Tom Holland is only 21 at this point, so he is a kid. But he seems like a young kid. He looks the part, and he's growing as a superhero. That part totally connects. But this does not satisfy as a Spider-Man movie. This satisfies as Iron Man adjacent. So, would I recommend seeing this movie? Sure. If you're not looking for any actual depth in the Spider-Verse, this movie is absolutely entertaining. I do not feel bad for having spent the $8 or whatever it was to see it. If you are looking for a subtext for Tony Stark, if you are looking for a little bit more into the Marvel Feige movie universe, then absolutely check out this movie. If you are looking for something that does proper by Spider-Man, if you are a big Spider-Man fan, you will hate this movie. There's not enough here. Again, we get a lot of stuff from Spider-Man on screen for the first time. That's fantastic. But that only goes so far. Kevin Smith makes it a point often when he's talking about people who complain about comic book movies. Well, I never thought we'd get any comic book movies to this level of quality in my life ever, so just the fact that it's on screen means it's good. I don't buy that. Just the fact that it's on screen is a step in the right direction towards quality. However, the depth, the soul that we get from those stories in the comics, you don't have to tell me a 3-hour story just to make it function properly. You don't have to give me any of that. What you do have to do is tell the story correctly. Tell the story so that it does what it needs to do for the character it's supposed to be about. And this didn't do that, sadly. And with that, I want to thank you very much for watching. This is Generally Nerdy. I am Generally Nerdy. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end through my ramblings. Leave me a comment in the comments section. Tell me what you thought. Go ahead and check out any of my other material. And thank you so much for watching once again. And you do need to remember, if it's generally nerdy, then it's probably here.